Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this episode. Actually, it's a doubleheader tonight of True Crime with the Sarge. I'm your host, Joseph Jackalone. If you joined us this morning, we had on Lauren Conlon. We were doing roll call. So today is a doubleheader. I think this is the first time I've done this, so it's actually pretty interesting. But tonight we have a very special guest. We have Dr. Peter Vronsky. I'm going to bring him on in a second. I just want to let everybody know on Friday we have Douglas McGregor, who's a geographical profiler, and that's at 6 p.m. And on Saturday at 1 p.m., Josh Zeman from the Killing Season will be back on the show on the 13th this Saturday at 1 p.m. So we're going to bring in Dr. Vronsky. Peter, it's good to see you. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me on, Sarge.
Yes, thank you. So you've written a bunch of books on the subject, right? So you got The Sons of Cain, The Times Square, Torso Murders, Female Serial Killers, American Serial Killers, The Epidemic Years, Serial Killers, Methods, and Monsters, right? I mean, geez, you've written at least 5, and there's plenty more. So how did you get involved with all of that kind of stuff? What got you involved?
By accident. My field is actually espionage. I have a PhD in espionage and counter-espionage and international relations. But spies are kind of serial offenders as well. And I'm talking about intelligence officers. I'm talking about spies who betray their own country and sell out to an adversary. They have similar psychopathologies. And so that, in a way, kind of prepared me to write about the history of serial killers, which, the story as it goes, I had as a young man a random encounter with the Torso Killer with Richard Cottingham. I was 23 years old, trying to check in to a hotel as he just set fire to 2 torsos up in his hotel room, and we passed each other on the elevator as he was fleeing the scene with 2 severed heads. I didn't, of course, know what was going on. I mean, the word serial killer, this was December 2nd, 1979. The term serial killer didn't even exist at that time. It was kind of used a little bit in the law enforcement community, but it doesn't appear until around 1981. The New York Times starts using it for the first time, that construct, to describe Wayne Williams. So along with that, of course, comes that concept of what a serial killer is, what we expect. The guy next door, your fellow worker who's a little quirky, or the guy you encounter on the elevator. And so I had completely forgotten about him. I ended up going to actually his floor because, in those years, 79, when you checked into a little bit of seedy hotel and you weren't there before, you do a little recce, a reconnaissance of the place before you go in. And so I wanted to go up before I decided I was going to stay there. And the only reason I remembered him is he annoyed me because he held up the elevator. I'm down in the lobby, punching that button. And I want to get on the streets of New York. I'm from Canada. So New York is a really exotic place for me. And I don't want to be sitting around in the lobby waiting to go upstairs. So I'm pushing that button, going, that jerk off. How long does it take to somebody to get on an elevator, right? And so the elevator finally, it was probably 40 seconds. It wasn't a big deal, but seemed like hours, right? And so no matter how hard I pushed that button, that elevator wasn't coming any faster. And so finally it comes down, and so I give the guy a dirty look, right? What's with this, right? And of course, he is kind of glassy-eyed. I'd make a terrible witness because I couldn't remember, if anybody interviewed me as to what he looked like, I couldn't tell you if he had a mustache or not. All I remember was the shape of his haircut and that he had a sheen of sweat on his face, and his eyes were like looking through me, almost like a blind man. And we did that thing, you sometimes do. You go left, the guy goes right, you go right, he goes, you do that little dance. and then he just walked through me and knocked me on the legs with some soft bag he was carrying, which I presume had the severed heads in it. It felt like bowling balls, and so I decided I'll go to his floor, and so I hit 4, all right, top floor, and so the moment I get off the floor, I could smell something burning, but I thought that's how the hotel smells. It was pretty cheap. It was $43 a night, right? So I thought, okay, that's what you get for $43, right? So I take a little walk around, and then when I come back by the elevator bank, I really now am beginning to smell stuff, and I see like a haze. And when I go around the corner, of course, now I see staff banging on doors and people going out, and I could see smoke just on the ceiling, like no flame, just smoke curling along the ceiling. And of course, that's a nightmare scenario, getting caught in the hotel in a fire, especially in those days. It wasn't like there were sprinklers, we're talking primitive era. And so I just went out down the stairs, and as I came out into 42nd Street, the fire department was arriving at that moment. And so I'm not staying here, forget this. And I just walked off to look for another hotel. I didn't even stick around to watch the show, right? Because I needed to, I was stranded. I needed to find a cheap hotel. And so the next morning, I get to my destination, and I'm in the lobby to pick up something there. And I read in the papers 2 torsos, sex work. Well, they didn't call them sex workers then. Prostitutes found in the Travel Inn hotel. And I go, oh my God, that's what I was smelling when I walked into. I never thought of the guy on the elevator. No connection. Completely out of my mind. Right. I fly home that afternoon. The story I tell my friends, at cocktails and drinks, always began with my getting off the elevator and smelling that smell. It's 18 months later. I'm in New York and I'm reading a local paper and I see the picture of the haircut. It's him, right? And that he's accused in the torso murders in New York. And I just realized, right, my God, that's the jerk off on the elevator, for crying out loud. So what are the odds, right? And that's how my book, essentially my first book, started. When I wrote that book maybe 20 years after the event. And they say write what you know. And so I started off with this book, how I encountered a serial killer, but I knew who he was. I encountered him in the wild, and I know who he was. But how many other people encounter serial killers next to them on a bus, in a parking lot, on a line in McDonald's? What are the odds? All right.
The Long Island
Railroad.
The
mathematics of it, right? And that's how I ended up writing about the history of where they came from.
It's actually a fascinating story. When I read it, and I knew you probably told it 100 times, but I was going to make you tell that story again anyway, because I thought that the audience would love to hear that story.
I got to do it another 100 times, I'm sure. But it's the alpha and omega of everything I'm doing, because 38 years later, I have a reunion with this guy, and that's the serial killer I'm working with. I am not a serial killer expert. My expertise is on their history, but I'm not a profiler. I'm not a psychologist. Right. I'm not a forensic psychiatrist, and none of that. I just know their history, where they come from, and I know the history of profiling, the investigative process. But I don't sell myself as an expert, except on this one guy. And the highest compliment I got was from Richard Cottingham himself, when he said to me one day, he says, you know me better than I know myself. And I think I do.
We're going to get into...
He's forgotten. There's things he didn't know about himself, which surprised me. Like, for example, nobody told him that his grandfather died in this car accident in 1931. It's like, don't you ask your father? Hey, Dad, who was your dad? Where's my grandfather? Like, well, what's with that? And it was a shock to him when I said, hey, I found in old newspaper reports your grandfather in 1931 was killed in a car accident, leaving, his grandmother with 7 uncles, one of them his dad, in the middle of the Depression. She's by herself raising 7, 3 of them were school-age kids, right? So it's a tough Irish Catholic family from the Bronx, from Mott Haven. They're like a clan, right? And they all live together according to the census. So that kind of almost family clan-like structure is very interesting. And of course, a lot of his murders, as I started putting them together, are kind of anchored around where the uncles lived, including 2 uncles in Massapequa, in Nassau County, just down the road from our friend Rex.
Right, and we're going to get into all that. Sherry has a question for you here. She says, Dr. Vronsky, did you speak with the police when what you had witnessed at the hotel, or this was something you didn't even realize at the time?
Well, first of all, I didn't realize it. Second of all, I was there on a job. And so even if I had realized it, I probably would have just gotten on the plane. And I don't want to be involved. I'm not talking to New York cops. I'm not even sure I'm supposed to be here. 79, we had a little bit of a trade war going on, and I was on a job in New York for a Canadian film company. They should have really hired someone in New York. They didn't. So I wouldn't have talked to the police, but I would have been useless as a witness anyway. But no, I didn't know. I didn't know until 8 months later. Funny, that's the first thing Cottingham asked me when we sat down in prison and we began talking. The first thing he's asked me, and he had these like frightened eyes. I don't know why he looked like a deer in the headlights. Did you talk to the police? Were you interviewed by the police? No. Is there something else that you're hiding still?
Yeah, exactly. I just wanted to make a quick shout out to Lupo Nina, who just donated 5 memberships to the channel. Thank you, Lupo Nina. Thank you very much for that. Now, so this is actually fascinating, right? Because Richard Cottingham's name comes up a bunch of times. I had former detective who former cold case guy, because that's where I used to work. Bill Simon, he was on the show, and he's been giving us the background on Richard Cottingham. And he told me, he's like, you got to speak to Pete. You got to get him on your show. So that's why I figured I'd just reach out to you and give it a shot and see what happens. So I'm glad it all worked out.
Bill was great, because our relationship kind of changed. Bill and I are working together with the NLIJ now on some of these cold cases, as Bill retired in 22. But when I first met Bill, he was on the other side of the wall. I mean, he was an active, on-duty cold case cop, and I was nobody. I was like a civilian knocking on NYPD's door, and nobody was opening the door. Wendell Stratford.
Yeah, Wendell. I had him on the show.
Yep. Wendell actually responded, and it was Tracy Horn, the author, of course, Restless Sleep, fellow author. We have the same publisher. Nobody was answering my calls at NYPD. And it's not like you can call a detective up. You call the switchboard and you ask for a detective, and they say, well, what's his number? and you go, well, don't you know? You're the switchboard. No, we don't know. Well, I don't have his number. How do I reach him? Well, they'll reach you if they need you. So I went to Tracy Horn through my publisher. Tracy put me together with Wendell, and God bless Wendell. He came out to my hotel. I was in New York. We sat down. He kind of looked me over to see just how crazy I was. And Wendell says, yeah, you should talk to somebody. And the next day, Bill Simon calls me. And so I go down and I see Bill, and that was like 2018. So we started working on first of all trying to locate the severed heads. You see, one of the heads is not identified. They never identified the second girl. There's a teenage girl somewhere with a very rare blood type, and nobody knows who she is. And so if we can recover the heads, we can maybe get a facial reconstruction of the remains. That could help. The DNA is less of a problem because she's buried on Hard Island, her torso. The only problem is of course, Bill tried to do a tap into the grave. And because of the geological shifting on Hard Island, which of course is the potter's field, nobody claimed their body. So with the geological shifting, they can no longer pinpoint where exactly she's buried. And so that would now entail big money, excavating, a trench. And so we could never do it. And so that head is now much more important to find because we can probably get a good DNA sample off the head, but we can reconstruct the face again. And so that's a chance with the rare blood type that it can be narrowed down. We may still be able to identify her. Older remains have been done. From the 1950s, they found remains. One of Harvey Glackman's victims from Colorado was identified. The guy was already put in the gas chamber, but his victim was identified maybe 8 years ago, again through DNA typing.
It's a small world, right? Because Wendell had gotten. I worked with Wendell. Wendell used to, work for me when he was a detective there. One of the best detectives that you'll ever meet in the world, hands down. And he got me Bill. He said, "You gotta bring Bill on," and then Bill had me reach out to you. So it's like we're all come full circle here because Wendell's been on this show too. So
yeah,
Bill, pretty interesting.
Bill was amazing because Bill, right on that day I came to see him. First time over, he gave me an hour. He heard me out, and then Bill goes, "What are you doing?" Right? I'm here for you. What do you want? Right? Well, take me to the site. The site is in the Palisades Interstate Park, so it's quite a drive. He was on Gold Street in Brooklyn. Mm-hmm. So yeah, he just put a sweatshirt on, jeans, and off we went, to New Jersey, and Cottingham had written a description of where he put the heads, and one of the things Cottingham said was that he buried it next to a type of tree. It just flies out of my head the type of tree, but I kind of lowballed it, right? Like, yeah, trees, 40 years later, trees are going to not be there and just change and stuff. But we get there, and there's this one old gnarly tree on that location, and Bill goes, "Oh, that's the tree." Right? I'm Googling, meanwhile, on my phone, what I should have done 6 months earlier, like what that tree looks like. And sure enough, it was that tree. And Bill is like digging under the tree, looking for corpse mushrooms. And he was in there up to his elbows. All right. So that was nice. That was my first contact with NYPD, other than meeting Wendell. Who, by then, Wendell, of course, was in the commissioner's office. So Wendell had a lot of pull. And so a search was organized very quickly. It, of course, meant interstate cooperation with your friends in Bergen County across the Hudson River. Mm-hmm. And boy, I don't know what New York and Bergen County did to each other, but it's like the Hatfields-McCoy feud, right? I ended up being the liaison between Bergen County and NYPD because I say you guys because you're ex-NYPD. Nobody wants to talk to each other. So it would be like Chief Angelotti, who was the head of the chief of detectives at Bergen County at that point in BCPO. Well, ask NYPD. Right, so I call NYPD. Well, tell Bergen County that. Well, can't you guys talk to each other? So that's how I ended up setting that website up, so that all the different jurisdictions can look at each other's cases without the indignity of actually having to call each other up. Like I still don't get it. I still don't get it, and it's not just interjurisdictional things, but there's these kind of rivalries within the same jurisdiction between different squads and different departments in Bergen County. Some towns have hung on to the authority to investigate homicides in their own town. It doesn't go to BCPO, the prosecutor's office. They co-investigate. Prosecutors are going to prosecute, but the town wants to hang on to its jurisdiction. And so I see that. I see that in Rockland County. I see that in Bergen County, where there's these kind of rivalries between a centralized, large investigative prosecutorial body and the local cops, who feel like they're in the community and they don't want kind of an anonymous police force investigating their community crimes. And so they have to work together because, of course, without the prosecutor, without the district attorney, there's going to be no case. But I've seen really bad stuff, like, you guys don't do this, we're not going, you guys can close the case, but we're not going to sign off on it. The DA is not going to sign off on it unless our detectives come with you, that kind of thing. So which surprised me because, again, I'm coming from the outside, outside the world of law enforcement. So I thought it's like on Law and Order.
Yeah, I'm not surprised, Pete. I'm certainly not surprised. But is there any plans to go back to the tree or the Palisades and do a real excavation out there or no?
Well, here's the thing. We went back several times, and Cottingham keeps giving us more information. He's got a geriatric memory, and so he's got good days, bad days, and often he is off by 5-6 years. I've identified cases that he thought he had done in the 1970s, early 1970s. Turns out it was 1968. And so unless I can trigger in his memory some event, usually a sporting event, a horse race, a boxing match that he lost money on or made money on because he was a degenerate gambler, all right? And so I have to kind of trigger some kind of association with the murder that helps me pinpoint the date, right? And then the location. And he didn't know where he was often because this is a guy who didn't fantasize about committing these murders. He told me that he lived the fantasy. He didn't have to fantasize. And so he was, I describe him as the American werewolf, except every night of the month was a full moon for him. He would just go out and spontaneously, on impulse, if he saw a victim, he would strike at that victim. No planning. He didn't, there's all this stuff that he had a trophy room. That's nonsense. There was no trophies. He didn't keep trophies. He didn't keep clippings. He never thought about the crimes afterwards. It was like it happened, and that's the end of it. And so they found very few items, and they were all from recent cases. So I think what it was they found some items that they linked victims to in the trunk of his car. And I think it wasn't a trophy. It was a matter of him just not getting rid of the evidence. But otherwise, it was, it's a remarkable how little physical evidence there was. This was really a circumstantial case against him. And people often underestimate circumstantial cases. Circumstantial cases sometimes are more valid and more important than with eyewitness testimony. I mean, eyewitness testimony is so flawed. Just look at me. I can, I see a serial killer. I'm bumped by him, but I don't remember if he had a mustache. So it was a unique case when it went to trial because it was the first time that a prosecutor kind of looked at pattern evidence and signature, all that, as John Douglas and Resler and Ann Burgess were doing those interviews, the famous Mindhunter interviews. That book wasn't out until '86. So the prosecutor, Kalo, in Bergen County, they had to put together a unique prosecution based on signature, because Cottingham changed his MO every time. Right? He strangled, he stabbed, he drowned, he suffocated. He even says that he shot one victim. And the victims varied in age, in profession. Only 30% were sex workers. The other 66% of the ones convicted. I don't know when we get to the 85 to 100, if we ever get through them, but of the 18 that we have now confirmed, 33% were sex workers. The others were schoolgirls, housewives. There was an X-ray technician. So, and the ages varied. Late 30s to 13 was the youngest. So in those days, and I'm not sure there would have been a connection made. If we put aside DNA and profiling today, I'm not sure the connection would have been even made today, because these cases, some were left outdoors, some were mutilated, some were turned into torsos. One case that right now is under investigation, and it looks like it's going to the FBI, was he took a woman from a young woman from New York. He brought her to New Jersey, killed her in New Jersey, cut her head off, left her torso in New Jersey, but put her head into a subway locker on 42nd and 8th. That arcade, in the subway there. He put her head in the locker there. NYPD can't find the file.
Yeah, I can attest to that.
How do you find the head in a locker and there's not a file? It's a newspaper. It's a little newspaper article. That's all it is. But I looked at the numbers of cold cases, of course, and we're talking thousands of unsolved murders, especially if you look from 1964, when Cottingham began to work in New York City daily, till 1980. I mean, we're talking about, I think, 17,000 murders and 7,000 not solved. And the only resource I have is old newspapers. And so I'm just skimming the top, the scum off that pool of dead people that are unsolved murders that never even were reported in the newspapers. I mean, 1980s and early 1990s, there were 4 or 5 homicides a day. And so unless it was something spectacular, newspapers, just another homicide. Right? So,
it was a different thing back then.
Where you put all those case files? And with the cost of real estate, none of that was digital. The cost of real estate storing that stuff. I know you guys have a warehouse somewhere in New Jersey, but nothing gets to that warehouse. It's already lost, right?
Yep.
So it's a challenge.
And Pokemon asks questions where all the missing files go. Well, just recently, about 2 years ago, the NYPD had a fire at one of their storage facilities, and they lost a whole bunch of cases and evidence in DNA cases too. And then we had Hurricane Sandy wiped out the Erie Basin. So there's been fires, floods, storm of locusts, asbestos, you name it. There's a couple of precincts in the Bronx we weren't allowed to go into the record room because it was asbestos. It was just covered in plastic, so you weren't allowed to go.
Yeah.
So these things, believe me. A part of being cold case, your first investigation was to actually find the case file. I mean, that was like the big investigation.
That's a challenge. I'd give Bill these lists, and Bill, Bill at one point was like, it was embarrassing for poor Bill. I gave him a list of 14. I found one. Right.
The other problem is that things get scattered. The district attorneys take cases. Cases end up behind a file cabinet somewhere in the precinct squad. I mean, we found them all over the place. So Yeah, it's a
Yeah.
tough situation. It's
I,
unfortunate, but
I did I did a little bit of work in New York in restoring homicide files, and I ended up going to families of deceased detectives who had retired, and a lot of families had the case files that the guy took home because they just can't let go of the case. He retires, he knows that nobody's ever going to investigate it, so he takes the case file home. He passes away, and the family doesn't know what to do. And so like from 1960 till about 1968, I restored the Toronto police homicide files that a lot of guys took home out of just, they won't let go. There's some cases that I'm sure you must have, cases that just bother you forever. And
yep,
and
we all have a case that bothers us, yeah, for certain. But New York
yeah,
City, we were kind of strict, whatever. I mean, nobody was taking these cases home. I mean, it could be in the 60s and 70s. Those detectives might have taken some of the
yeah,
cases home
those
too.
times, yeah,
But
yeah,
yeah, the
different
the
time.
current environment there, nobody's taking those cases home. But it's just a lot of people don't understand it. New York City is huge. I'm trying when people really they don't realize how big it is. At the time, you were dealing with 75 precincts. You're dealing with eight public service, the housing cops, the transit police. I mean, you had all these had three different police departments running around New York City. It was an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, and the anarchy in the 1970s. I mean, New York was bankrupt. Right. I'm not sure how old you are. Maybe you were a kid in the 70s. You
Yep,
might remember. Yeah, you'll remember what that was like.
yep.
I mean, the
I
Bronx is burning, as Howard
I
Cosell
remember
said.
Son of Sam very well. I remember all that stuff as a
Right.
kid.
Yeah,
So yeah,
so that was a everything. Nothing worked. Nothing worked. It was just total anarchy. I mean, oddly, people have a nostalgia for that period, right? Dirty old New York.
yeah, because they didn't
And
live through it. They didn't live
there
through
was
it.
a buzz you got off the anarchy of the chaos, but do you want to live in that? No, not really.
Yeah, no, you don't.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit more about Richard Cottingham because you were part of just a recent case, right? In 2022, he was charged with 5 homicides from Nassau County, I believe. Right? You had
Yes.
Diane Cusick, Mary
Yes.
Beth Hines, Laverne Moy, Sheila Hyman, and Maria Nieves. Right? So they had
Yes.
5 cases that you guys helped put together that the district attorney
Yeah. It
charged him
started.
with.
Yeah, it started. It started with an interview that Jennifer Weiss attended in Trenton, where 9 different departments brought her to Cottingham, and he had a thing for her because he killed her mother, and it was a way for him. I think he's looking to atone for what he did. He admits that he has no remorse; it's not in him, but he knows what remorse is, and I would describe it as cognitive remorse. And so he wanted to do this for Jennifer, and Bill was part of that meeting, and he babbled out all these case descriptions, and of course he didn't know the names. He didn't know the exact locations or the times, but he just babbled out these cases. And when I started looking at what he described and started piecing things together and then following up with him, he led me to the murder of Diane Cusick uh, on Google Maps. I got Google Maps up and I had him on the phone, and he got me to the corner of where his mother-in-law lived, which was there's so many dead girls around Springfield Boulevard and Jamaica Avenue. It's like a like a sun around which dead girls are orbiting like planets. Okay, and so some of them he would abduct in Queens Village, and he would take them across into Nassau County and leave them there. Some he would leave there. Sometimes he brought victims from Nassau County, but for some reason he was obsessed with the murder of Diane Cusick, and so he gave me driving directions, turn by turn, to the Sunrise Highway, and he says, "You're looking for a drive-in." and there's no drive-in. I mean, they don't exist anymore. But there's a Sunrise Drive-in Sonic. And so when I started looking at old maps and old aerial photographs, I see there was a drive-in, the Sunrise Drive-in, and it's right next to the Green Acres Mall.
Well,
and so when I pulled on that case from the newspaper reports, I read in the paper that they had just cleared about 7 years ago. They cleared a suspect in that case with perpetrator DNA that was accidentally preserved. The case was from 1968. So nobody was sampling DNA until the 1990s. It's 1980s. It gets into the courts. So it was just accidentally preserved, and the DNA was good enough to clear a suspect. So I got a hold of Detective Danny Finn at Nassau County, and I went down there and we surveyed the scene. And I told Danny, look, you got to take a run at this DNA. And I gave him a list of other cases that matched kind of Cottingham's signature. And so they got a match. And I was brought in. I testified to the grand jury on how I located the Green Acres Mall and what Cottingham had told me. And with the DNA match, that's the first time he's indicted since the 1980s, because he was voluntarily confessing prior. But here they had him now, right? And the one thing Cottingham didn't want is to be extradited to New York. They were ready, or at least they told him they were ready. They were going to extradite him if he didn't make a plea deal. Right? And so they leveraged 4 other case closures. 3 of them were on my list. One of them was a surprise to me. I knew about her, but I kind of put her on the Hyman. I put her on the lower scale of probability. So the way I would work is I would rate like the most likely Cottingham cases. Not to waste people's time with it's a 20% chance or 30% chance and so forth, right? Whatever that means, but so I tried to give them like 70% chances. For example, 3 girls were in that creek, 2 African American girls, 1 white girl. The 2 African American girls came from Queens Village, and they lived about 1,000 yards apart, right between where Cottingham's mother-in-law's house was. And they went missing in Queens, but were found in Nassau. Right now, they closed the case of one. The other one never was declared a homicide. They could never determine cause of death. They found her in the same river. Right, she was about maybe 800 yards downriver from the other 2 girls, but never declared a homicide. They no longer had the file since it wasn't a homicide. I got about 4 like that in Nassau County that they don't have the file for it simply because they were never, the ME never declared them homicides. And Cottingham has admitted to their mind, I did it, but with all due respect, I think it's important that everybody, not get into like the confession killer syndrome, with Lucas, where he was confessing to 600 murders and everybody was running and closing them without really confirming it. And I think, law enforcement is very aware of that. So I got to say this, none of the case closures occurred without them finding something that Cottingham knew that wasn't in the papers, that was just in the case files. And that's difficult too, because those cases in the 60s and 70s, I mean, everything was blabbed out in the papers. All the details.
The reporters would be in the crime scene taking photos.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's difficult to find, holdbacks, very few holdbacks. The same with Bergen County. I mean, Robert Angelotti very meticulously made sure that Cottingham came up with something that was, not in the papers, not public knowledge at that time. So the same thing with Nassau County.
What kind of scale did you use to give the probability?
I used the scale. It wasn't scientific, but there were things like the age, the occupation, the location is very important. Because he did it in clusters. Each in the cluster. One commonality among the victims everywhere was they were missing their shoes. Their shoes were gone, and that was a big mystery. Is this guy a shoe fetishist? They didn't find any female shoes in his house, and so you had to ask him, and the answer was very simple. I learned to have them take their shoes off because I didn't want to get kicked. And so victims are found missing their shoes. Like, where did the shoes go? And the shoes remain. He tossed them somewhere where he was abducting the victims. He would always abduct them in one place, kill them in the second place, and then, as he puts it, drop them off at a third place. And the first time he says, I dropped her off, I'm thinking, like, you drop off your kids at school, you drop off your date at her house. I finally realized when he says dropped off, he means I dumped her, right? I dropped her off. So he definitely would go to 3 different locations, unless he was interrupted or something went wrong. And there was a few cases where victims were found in the place he killed them. But usually there were 3 different crime scenes to deal with.
What was his major mistake that led to his capture?
It's embarrassing, If I was a serial killer, it's like, you go back to the end of the line, you idiot. Right? He kills a girl in a motel in New Jersey, and he stuffs her body under the bed. Okay. The hotel room apparently is either rented out for another night or remains vacant for a night. So the day after, cleaning staff come in, and the cleaning lady is vacuuming, and she goes to vacuum under the bed, and ka-chunk, damn, I can't get the vacuum under the bed. She lifts up the bed covers. Oh my God, right? She runs out screaming. There's a body under the bed, right? He sent the girl in to rent the room while he waited outside. This is the Quality Inn on Route 17 in Hasbrook Heights, very close to his home in Lodi, right? So the staff are now spooked. So this genius now, something like 20 days later, comes back to the same hotel with another girl, right? And he starts torturing her in his room. And of course, the hotel staff are spooked, and now hotel security, they hear a girl screaming, which, in those days, who would call security for just somebody screaming? Like, yeah, it's a passion moment, but they're so spooked that right away they call hotel security. And they call a local Hasbrook Heights patrol officer comes in, right? And he comes in with a shotgun as Cottingham opens the door and rushes with all his junk. He was drugging a lot of his victims with sedatives and whiskey. He had harnesses and gags and handcuffs, right? So he runs out past the hotel security and the people crowding around the door to the back door. And as he goes around the corner, there's a patrolman standing there with a shotgun who actually was peeking around the corner. Cottingham didn't see him. He was peeking around the corner and he saw him running. So he just racks one and stands there with the shotgun as he comes around the corner. That's what it took to take down this serial killer who I suspect was killing from 1963 until 1980. He says he killed 85 to 100 women in that period. we confirmed 1967 to 1980. And if you take 100 and divide it through 1967 to 1980, that's one every 6 weeks. Before DNA, before cell phones, before databases, before interjurisdictional cooperation, for whatever that's worth. So it was entirely doable. It's very plausible. But I think I think he killed more than 100. I think he's underestimating. And he, amazingly, nobody knows about him. Ted Bundy and Cottingham are only 18 hours apart in age. And yet everybody knows Ted Bundy. Nobody has heard of Richard Cottingham until lately. And partly because he became a hermit. Once he was convicted, he didn't do any interviews. He didn't, sell memorabilia. He didn't write a lot of letters. He just disappeared until a Canadian journalist who also resembled Dida Godarzi, a Tunisian journalist, Nadia Fitsani, convinced him to do an interview. And in that interview, for the first time, first of all, he admitted that he committed those murders in New York and New Jersey back in the 70s, because he maintained his innocence right to the end. For the first time, he admits that in 2009, and he tells Nadia, I committed 85 more or less to 100 more or less perfect murders. That's how he described them. And of course, everybody kind of laughed, because Nadia, of course, is not an expert either. Oh, she's just a journalist. He's bragging to her. And of course, the next year, he confesses to the murder of Nancy Vogel in 1967. And suddenly, we now go back, we add 10 years to his killing career, because he was convicted for murders between 77 and 1980. Now we know, holy damn, his first maybe was in 1967. And that makes him very precocious, because the average age for a serial killer when they first kill is around 27, 28. But in 1967, he was 20 years old, very young. And he just described to me about 2 weeks ago what he says is his first murder, and it's in high school. He tells me he killed the mother of his girlfriend in high school. And I'm trying to track down the case, because the family thought that she left the family, that she ran away.
Oh boy.
Yeah, I know. And go find that case, because he doesn't remember names, he doesn't remember locations, and so right now I'm actually working getting help from a detective who worked on one of the 1977 cases, Alan Greco, who I've been consulting with, who knows Cottingham and negotiated that first confession, that 1967 that confession in 2010, which he pled to in the 1967 murder, was actually negotiated in the 1990s. But the governor of New Jersey, it was a female governor, Chris Winton, I think was her name. When Department of Corrections approved, the Attorney General approved, everybody was going to do the deal, and she had political issues where it looked like she was too soft on crime, and so the idea that we would make a deal with a serial killer was politically inexpedient, and so she canceled the deal. So it took another 10 years. New governor, new investigator, Robert Angelotti starts questioning Cottingham in 2004, and for the next right up until he retires in 2021, Angelotti kept closing one case after another, until he became chief. Once he became chief, he didn't have time anymore, and then Jennifer Weiss and I started helping him by kind of, the problem with Cottingham is he talks a lot, right? And so the way he tells you things is as I kind of play. We're about 9 years apart in age, and so we play. I bond with him on nostalgia. What were the clubs that we would hang out with in New York in the 1970s? Where did he go? Where did I go? Our tastes in music were different. I was kind of downtown punk rock, Canal Street, the Bowery. He was Upper East Side Celtic music bars, right? Singles bars. And so we compare notes, and you know I would say, for example, hey, Rich, back in the 1970s, what was the best place for pastrami in New York? And he starts describing this place where you get the best pastrami, and then he says, oh, yeah, I left the body behind the pastrami place on the way to the pastrami place. And then he goes off on this tangent and he starts describing this murder. If you ask him, and that was exhausting for police, because you guys don't have that time. I've got that time, right? Because I'm an amateur, right? But your average cold case detective, he's juggling how many cases? I saw Bill had 40 cases on his desk, right? Yeah. And he's just moving them like Rubik's Cube. What's the least line of resistance today? Who can I go interview today? What can I look at today, right? I just got this one guy, and I can put all my time into him. So I could spend hours talking about pastrami with him. And that's how a lot of these case closures came out of him just remembering things and going off on these tangents.
Just wanted to give a shout out to Jersey Jen. Thank you for gifting that membership, Jersey. So let's just switch gears for the time we have left in regards to Rex Heuermann now as the suspected Long Island serial killer, right? So a lot of people didn't think that serial killers changed MOs, right? But here you have explained to us pretty succinctly that Richard Cunningham, he kind of didn't have an MO, right? He was like all over the place and kind of
yeah.
And do you see, I mean, I could see them. Do you see any similarities between Cunningham's cases, with these torso murders and then not cutting people up? And the same thing now with the alleged suspect in Long Island serial killer, Rex Heuermann?
Well, the thing is about, MO, serial killers change their MO all the time. MO is a learning process. MO, modus operandi, is what you need to do to accomplish the crime. And sometimes a witness arrives or something happens that you don't expect. Somebody comes home. And so MO constantly changes. What doesn't change is the signature. What is the psychological reward that the serial killer is seeking from committing that crime? That's what stays the same, right? And so it's a myth that MO does, it's constantly changing, and so certainly for all serial killers, the primary signature is their need for control over the victim, right? It's all about control and how they express it. And so it's the expression that you're looking for when you're profiling a crime scene. The MO just gives you some technical information about, how he was going about it, whether it's slitting a window screen or whether it's, putting a baby seat in the back of the car so he looks more harmless. Oh, the guy has a baby seat in the back of his car. Oh, he must be okay. He's got a baby seat in the back of his car. Right. So that's MO. And so with Rex Heuermann, of course, I'm not really a good person to be asking about him because, again, I'm not an expert, and that case is just such a, I hate to be selfish this way. But my Suffolk County cases are hurting from all the attention that investigators in Suffolk County are putting into the Rex Heuermann case, and of course it makes sense, of course, because you got the freshest evidence, and it's recent, relatively recent, so it makes sense. Plus, the eyes of the world are on Suffolk County right now on on this case. And of course, I talked to Cottingham a lot about the case too, and he kind of has these discussions like how would he go about things now, with DNA and with cell phones. I mean, it's not just the perpetrator that carries a cell phone, but the victim also carries. And who doesn't have a cell phone? All right, that's a huge bonus, and certainly in the Rex Heuermann case, the cell phone data is such a big part of the case. I mean, it's major, and I think whatever DNA they have is like slivers, a hair there. I think they found his wife's hair on one victim. All right, so it's just those cell phone hits are beyond coincidence, and that's how that kind of evidence gets put together. But we don't really know enough about him to exactly see his signature. I mean, what is his signature? We're finding bodies buried in kind of a private graveyard. We're assuming that he picked out. Does it mean he revisits them? Ted Bundy would revisit his victims in his own private yard. So a lot of serial killers do that. They come back and they commune with the victims they possess. So how much of this is possession? How much do we know about the case anyhow? If there's going to be a trial, assuming that he doesn't just plead guilty and it's over, if there's going to be a trial, we'll learn a lot more. But if there isn't that kind of adversarial defense and prosecution, he pleads, he does an allocution the way the BTK killer does. He'll tell us whatever he wants to tell us, and we may never know.
What do you make of Cottingham dismembering some victims and not dismembering others? Because we see Rex Heuermann now has been charged with a case where it was a torso murder, where he had removed the arms and the head and the legs. And now there are several other torso cases that they're probably looking at to see if they can attribute to him. What do you get out of that with Cottingham? Maybe we can glean something out of Cottingham's case to kind of tie it to what they're dealing with out in Suffolk.
Well, he told me that he did everything deliberately so there would be no connecting. I mean, he had that notion before, the world of serial killers. He had that notion that if he doesn't mix it up, as he says, they're going to connect it. There's a in those days they used to call them, multiple perpetrators, multiple killers. They even called them mass killers at one point, right? Which of course now means something else. So he was very forensically aware. For example, he described to me how he would be careful not to leave tire tracks. One way I was always able to recognize a Cottingham crime scene where he would leave a body was the line of sight you would have to any approaching cars. He would see cars, he would pick places where he would see cars coming from 800, 1,000 yards away. At night, he would see the headlights coming. Right? And I was at some of those places and I looked and why didn't he put the body there? Because it's more hidden there. But when I looked at that location, I realized he doesn't have that view of the road from that location. Things like that. So I think the same thing could apply to, if you're going to dismember somebody, you need a place, you need a tool, you need a saw. There's going to be blood. There's going to be, it's going to be messy. So you need the time. To do that, you need a location. So, it's a question of, is it a question of pathology that he had this kind of fantasy of dismembering bodies, or was it strategic? Was it, something he had to do because he wanted to transport the body more easily?
And it was a light bulb moment when you said that, though, Pete, because have you been to Gilgo? Have you visited the locations?
I've been in the area. I haven't been actually in Gilgo. No.
Okay, because talking about 1,000 yards straight, I mean, Gilgo, and before they put the lights in, before they did anything, that place was pitch black. You could see a car coming for 20 miles probably. I mean, that's
Right.
how dark that, and it's a straight run. So it's not like there's lots of curves. So when you said that about Cottingham picking out locations based on the what do you call it, the line of sight?
Yep. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah. Exactly.
that triggers that in that respect because when you stand at Gilgo and you take a look and you're looking towards the city, you're looking west. I mean, it's a straight run, and it's kind of interesting how you brought that up. I just wanted to thank Forrest Nelson, who gifted 5 memberships to the channel. Forrest, thank you for your continued support of this channel. I really appreciate that. Yeah, that's actually a little interesting tidbit there.
Yeah, and he Rex, of course, was hiding the bodies. Cottingham's bodies were found very quickly, and he told me that he always left bodies where they could be quickly found because out of respect for the victim, that he didn't want animals getting at the victim. So he always would leave them where they would get, found quickly. You want to comment? Well, there was other ways you could have shown respect, like maybe not killing them in the first place,
Right.
right? But that's how he explained it. He said, and it's true. All those, he didn't bury any bodies. He didn't hide them, except, even the body of Dita Godarzi, who he knew. I mean, several victims he knew for years. He knew Lorraine McGraw, who he murdered in Rockland County. He knew her for about 2 years, year and a half. He knew Dita Godarzi, and he occasionally he would meet them like for a coffee or a drink. He had friendly relationships with prostitutes, which a lot of sex worker killers do as well. They have a strange kind of love-hate relationship. They'll hang out at the donut store where sex workers hang out, and they chat, and they kind of look out for them. Cottingham gave one girl a kitten, right? His girlfriends. By the way, Cottingham had a wife, 3 kids, 2 girlfriends, and a third girl that he was running as a prostitute, kind of as a hobby. He wanted to try his hand at pimping. And he put in an 8-hour workday, never missed a day of work, right? So when he slept is a mystery. And both his girlfriends were nurses, and they worked different shifts. So he always worked the night shift. He would get off the night shift. He would go see one of the nurses, and then he would go see the other nurse. But he always came home by sunrise because he didn't want to see the neighbors to see that he stayed away. And he would see his kids off to school and then go to sleep so he can go on the evening shift. Right. So, just the same.
Yeah. Wow. I have one more question for you because we're over the hour, but I just wanted to wish Forrest Nelson a happy birthday. He came up, they came up and they so happy birthday, Forrest. It's interesting. There's a couple of things that you said that I'm just going to pick up on because one of the bodies that Rex was just charged with, that of Jessica Taylor, was left way out in the open, that it was easily discovered, that was easily found. And there was another female victim, Valerie Mack, almost same location. I think it's about a quarter mile from where Jessica, right out in the open. The dog walker found it. I mean, it was just right there. And then others are a bit buried. So it's kind of interesting because it's almost kind of like the same thing when you hear about it. Now, just the last thing I want to keep, because it's an important aspect of it. The wife and the kids, did they have any knowledge of what this guy was doing? Did the wife have any knowledge that this guy had 2 girlfriends and
she had suspicions, but you know what? I interviewed Marina Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's widow.
Wow.
And I asked her that same question, and Marina said the wife is always the last to know.
It's interesting because it's a big part of the contention about what's going on with the Rex Sherman case and stuff like that. So I just figured I would pick your brain on this. Pete, I could
think
talk to you for hours.
The wife suspects something else other than my husband's a serial killer. I think the first suspicion is he's fooling around. All right, and certainly his wife searched the trunk of his car at one point.
This is
and
Cottingham you're talking about.
A shopping bag full of female credit cards. Okay. And she didn't take the cards, but she wrote down all the numbers. And so she had those numbers after Cottingham was arrested. She had those numbers. The police ran the numbers. They found all the women. They were all alive, but all of them reported that their credit cards and wallets were stolen in the bar where Cottingham used to hang out, Flanagan's. So
pretty amazing.
He and that girl he had were also stealing wallets and running credit card scams. So
unbelievable.
He was doing a lot of stuff beyond just murder. But that's typical as well of serial killers. I mean, we forget that they're doing all sorts of other petty crimes that sometimes killing is just part of the game, because they have no remorse. So whether you steal a credit card or you kill someone, it's the same thing. For them, there's no degree of remorse or degree of gravity at all.
Sheila is asking, would you be able to come back on and do a part 2? Because I could talk to you for hours about this stuff. So,
well, thank you. Anytime. It'd be my pleasure.
Okay, that'd be awesome. Yeah, I'd love to have you back. We are over the hour right now, but it was a fascinating. I looked up at the clock and I couldn't believe how fast it went. But
and I got questions for you too. I mean,
sure.
I don't know too many cold case guys, so one day I'd like to interview you.
Anytime you're ready, just let me know. We could set it up.
I was in Fort Apache with the Guardian Angels. Curtis Leva took me down there
in the 4-1 precinct.
Yeah, so I think I'm one of the few people in the world who's been at every subway station in New York, because I rode with Curtis and the Guardian Angels for about 3 years. I wanted to make a documentary, so I rode every patrol they did for 3 years, shot thousands of photos, and I've been every subway station. Took me, like I said, 2.5 years or something, but
yeah, I think I think I've spent about half my career working in the Bronx, starting in 1992. Wow. So, in Brooklyn North and in Brownsville, because there's a lot of cases and a lot of different things. But we're going to talk again, because I definitely want to have you on again, because this was quite informative. Doc, you hang out 1 second. We're going to say goodbye to everybody else. Everybody, you guys have a great night. We'll see you on Friday, 6 p.m. for Douglas McGregor, and we're going to talk about geographical profiling. You guys have a great night. Thanks for coming.